A little girl's night turned into a nightmare. In the silence of her home, a terrifying intruder crept in, one whose presence would change everything. What happened that night is more chilling than anything you've ever imagined, and the shocking truth about how it all unfolded, it will leave you speechless. Stay with us until the end to find out how this horrific crime changed an entire community and one family forever. A soft breeze swept through the quiet neighborhood. The air carried the faint scent of flowers and freshly cut grass. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a distant park. In the heart of this calm, a mother stood at her doorway. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edges of the screen door. "Sandra," she called, her voice thin, desperate. The name faded into the wind. The afternoon sun hung low, painting long shadows on the pavement. Sandra's bicycle lay abandoned by the curb. Its pink frame glinted under the golden rays. One handlebar was slightly twisted, the streamers limp and dusty. Her little shoes weren't far from it, neatly placed as though forgotten. The shoes seemed out of place, too deliberate, too neat. The mother's chest tightened. Neighbors gathered, hushed whispers passing between them. Eyes darted toward the distant field, toward the wooded edge beyond. The first police car arrived, its lights silent but spinning. A man in uniform stepped out, speaking softly but firmly. He scanned the scene, his gaze lingering on the abandoned bicycle. The mother's cries grew sharper, cutting through the air. Time dragged, minutes stretching into hours. Search parties formed, flashlights cutting through the gathering dusk. They combed the area, their footsteps crunching on brittle grass. Dogs sniffed the earth, their handlers following close behind. Every rustle in the bushes made hearts jump. Night fell, cloaking the town in uneasy silence. The searchlights cast eerie glows on trees, on fences, on empty streets. Hours turned to days. Flyers with Sandra's picture papered every surface. Her bright smile stared back from street poles and store windows. The town held its breath, a collective weight pressing on every chest. Then came the suitcase, a battered thing, dark and scuffed, left beside a drainage ditch. Its zipper was partially undone, revealing a corner of something pale. The air around it seemed to freeze. The officer closest to it hesitated, his hand hovering over his radio. The smell hit before the sight, acrid, sour, unmistakable. He knelt slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. The others approached, their faces pale under the flashing blue lights. The zipper came down in one slow, agonizing motion. What they found stole the breath from their lungs. The body was small, crumpled, lifeless. Sandra's face was barely recognizable, pale and swollen. Her once bright eyes were closed, her expression frozen in silence. The suitcase lining was stained, dark and ominous. A ragged teddy bear, its fur matted and damp, lay beside her. The officers turned away, some stifling gasps, others wiping their faces. The air grew heavier, suffocating, the weight of discovery crushing them. The crime scene tape unfurled with a sharp snap. Flashing lights painted the area in haunting shades of red and blue. Reporters arrived, their cameras clicking like intrusive whispers. The mother's scream pierced the night as news reached her. It wasn't a scream of shock. It was one of heartbreak, raw and unfiltered. Neighbors gathered again, their faces etched with sorrow and disbelief. Murmurs filled the air, questions laced with dread. Who could have done this? Why Sandra? The suitcase told its own story. Fingerprints, fibers, smudged dirt. The investigators combed through every detail with methodical precision. A patch of grass nearby was trampled, showing signs of a struggle. A single shoe print, too large to belong to a child, stood out. The ditch water ran slow and murky, carrying faint traces of the horror. Evidence bags were filled, scraps of fabric, strands of hair, fragments of hope. The town fell into an uneasy silence that night. Locks were double-checked, windows secured, children held tighter than ever. But questions lingered in every household, refusing to be silenced. Parents tucked their kids into bed with trembling hands. Sandra's face haunted their thoughts, her laughter now a ghostly echo. Some prayed, their whispered words trembling with fear. Others stared into the darkness, wondering who among them was capable of such evil. The morning brought no comfort. The weight of grief hung over the town like a thick fog. A memorial began to grow near the ditch, flowers and candles piling up. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows, fragile against the cold wind. Sandra's story had shaken them all. But somewhere, someone wasn't grieving. They were watching, waiting. The candlelight flickered in the dark, but the wind wasn't what made it uneasy. Somewhere in the crowd at the memorial, eyes lingered too long. A man, ordinary enough to fade into the background, stood with his hands in his pockets. He wasn't crying. His gaze was fixed, sharp, scanning the faces of the grieving. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips before he turned away. The police worked tirelessly, piecing together a puzzle built from horror. Witnesses came forward, but their stories were fragments, inconsistent and blurred by fear. A neighbor recalled seeing Sandra skip down the street that afternoon. Another remembered a van parked near the corner, a van no one recognized. The shoeprint near the suitcase was matched to a common brand, sold everywhere. No fingerprints, no clear DNA, just a faint trail of shadows. Sandra's mother clung to the last picture taken of her little girl. It was snapped just days before, Sandra smiling wide in a flowered dress. Now that smile was a memory, one that cut deeper with every glance. The town leaned into its fear, suspicions spreading like wildfire. Neighbors looked at each other differently now, with questioning eyes. Every knock on the door, every late-night sound, sent chills down spines. Parents held their children closer, forbidding them to wander far. The playground was empty, swings swaying idly in the cold breeze. And then, a break. A woman came forward, hesitant, her voice trembling. She had seen someone at the edge of the field near the drainage ditch. A man with a suitcase, struggling to carry it as he hurried away. He wore a dark jacket, a baseball cap pulled low, obscuring his face. The woman's details were vague, her memory clouded by distance and fear. But it was enough to ignite a renewed urgency in the investigation. The police released a sketch, a faceless figure with a shadowed cap. Tips began pouring in, each one more frantic than the last. The town held its breath, desperate for justice. And in a dimly lit room, far from prying eyes, the man from the memorial smiled. The room was sparse, almost eerily so. A single chair sat near a wooden table, its surface scratched and worn. On it rested a collection of newspapers, their headlines screaming Sandra's name. The man flipped through them slowly, savoring every word. Tragic discovery. Community in mourning. Search for the killer intensifies. He chuckled under his breath, the sound low and chilling. His fingers traced the printed photo of Sandra's bright, innocent face. For a moment, he paused, his expression unreadable. Then he folded the paper neatly, setting it aside with a strange care. A knock echoed through the room. It wasn't a hard knock, just a soft, hesitant tap. The man's head snapped toward the door, his smile vanishing. "Yeah," he called, his voice calm, almost friendly. The door creaked open, revealing a young delivery boy. "Your order," the boy said, holding out a plain paper bag. The man reached for it, his movements deliberate, measured. Their hands brushed briefly, and the boy shuddered at the touch. "Thanks," the man said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The boy nodded quickly, his face pale, as he backed out of the doorway. The door clicked shut, and silence reclaimed the space. The man set the bag on the table, but he didn't open it. Instead, he stood there motionless, listening. Outside, a dog barked faintly in the distance. A car passed, its tires crunching on gravel. The man walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. Through the gap, he scanned the empty street. Satisfied, he let the curtain fall and turned back to the table. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipping through its pages. Names, times, places, each written in tight, precise handwriting. At the bottom of one page, a single word was circled in red ink: Sandra. He tapped the pen against his lip, thinking, calculating. Then, with a quick stroke, he crossed out her name. One down. The man's smile returned as he stared at the next name on the list. The next name was Mia. It was written neatly, like the others, but with an underline that seemed deliberate. The man ran his finger over the ink, as if tracing the letters gave him clarity. He closed the notebook with a soft snap and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. The air in the room felt heavier now, as though it shared his dark intent. He walked to the sink, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. The faucet groaned as he turned it on, water sputtering before flowing steady. He let it run, staring at the stream as if lost in thought. The silence was broken only by the steady drip of water hitting the steel sink. Finally, he splashed his face, letting the cold shock him back to focus. His reflection stared back from the cracked mirror above the sink. A face too ordinary, too unremarkable, a face no one would remember. It was his greatest weapon. He smirked at himself, a fleeting expression that faded as quickly as it came. Turning, he reached for the duffel bag propped against the wall. Inside were the essentials: gloves, tape, a folding knife. Each item placed with care, each one chosen for its purpose. The zipper closed with a low hum, sealing his preparations in silence. The man stepped out into the cool night, his breath visible in the air. The streetlights buzzed faintly, their yellow glow pooling on the empty road. He walked with purpose, blending effortlessly into the shadows. A car passed by, headlights sweeping over him briefly before disappearing. He didn't flinch, didn't quicken his step. He was invisible in his own way. The neighborhood he entered was quieter, the houses larger, well-kept. The kind of place where people felt safe behind locked doors. But locked doors didn't matter to him. He stopped in front of a two-story home, its windows dark and curtains drawn. His eyes scanned the property, noting the details: a side gate, an unlocked shed. A faint light flickered upstairs, likely a night light in a child's room. The corner of his mouth twitched into a smile. Mia lived here, and he was ready. The man lingered in the shadows, studying the house. Every detail mattered: the rhythm of the wind against the trees, the hum of distant traffic. The world outside moved as if nothing were wrong. He adjusted the duffel bag on his shoulder, the weight a steady reminder of his intent. The side gate creaked slightly as he pushed it open. He froze, listening. No movement inside, no shifting curtains or sudden lights. Satisfied, he slipped through, the damp grass muffling his footsteps. The backyard was pristine, the kind of place where children played safely under watchful eyes. A swing set stood in the corner, its chains swaying lightly in the breeze. A doll lay on the ground, forgotten, its plastic face tilted toward the sky. The sight made him pause, just for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his attention to the sliding glass door. It was locked, but locks were never a problem for him. From his pocket he pulled a small toolkit, the contents as precise as his intentions. Within seconds, the door gave way with a soft click. He stepped inside, his movements deliberate, measured. The house smelled faintly of lavender and something sweet, like freshly baked cookies. It was quiet, save for the soft hum of a refrigerator in the kitchen. The man let his eyes adjust to the darkness, his ears tuned for the faintest sound. The stairs loomed ahead, their polished wood gleaming faintly in the moonlight. His gaze shifted upward, toward the faint glow from the second floor. He climbed the stairs slowly, his hand grazing the railing to steady his steps. The hallway stretched before him, lined with family photos. Smiling faces stared back, blissfully unaware of the danger that lurked. He stopped at the third door on the left, the one with stickers framing the frame. Unicorns, stars, and rainbows, a child's sanctuary. Mia's room. His hand rested on the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shiver through him. He turned it carefully, the latch barely making a sound as it released. The door eased open, revealing a small figure curled up beneath a pink blanket.
Mia.
She was asleep, her breathing soft and steady, clutching a stuffed rabbit. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her. His hand reached into the bag, fingers brushing against the tools he'd brought. And then he moved closer. The floorboards creaked faintly beneath his weight. Mia stirred but didn't wake, her tiny hand tightening around the stuffed rabbit. The man froze, holding his breath. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a moon. It cast long shadows on the walls, turning the quiet space into something almost surreal. His shadow stretched over the bed, dark and looming. He reached into the duffel bag, pulling out a pair of gloves. The fabric whispered against his skin as he slipped them on. His eyes never left her, the slow rise and fall of her chest mesmerizing. He crouched low, his face level with hers. Her innocence was palpable, radiating like warmth in the stillness. For a fleeting moment, something shifted in his gaze. A flicker of doubt, a crack in the mask he wore so
well.
But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold focus that had guided him this far. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering just above her shoulder. The rabbit slipped from her grip, tumbling to the floor with a soft thud. Mia's eyes fluttered open, her small face crinkling with confusion. She blinked up at him, her expression shifting from drowsy to startled. "Who?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. His hand moved swiftly, covering her mouth before the word could fully escape. Her muffled cries were soft, panicked, her small hands clawing at his wrist. "Shh," he hissed, his voice low and steady. Tears welled in her wide, terrified eyes, spilling down her cheeks. The man glanced toward the door, his ears straining for any sound. The house remained silent, the world beyond oblivious to what was unfolding. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "It'll be quick," he whispered, as if offering some twisted form of comfort. Mia's struggles weakened, her tiny frame trembling beneath his grip. He reached for the duffel bag again, pulling it closer, its contents rattling softly. And then a sound. A sharp creak from the hallway, followed by faint footsteps. His head snapped up, his grip on Mia loosening slightly. Someone was awake. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate but hesitant, as if someone were testing the silence. The man's body tensed, his every sense on high alert. Mia whimpered beneath his hand, the sound barely audible, but enough to send a chill through him. "Shh," he hissed again, more forcefully this time. He reached for the duffel bag, his fingers closing around the handle of the knife. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. The shadow of someone standing in the hallway stretched across the floor. His heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears. A soft voice broke the tension, whispering, "Mia?" It was a woman's voice, gentle, familiar, tinged with concern. The doorknob turned slowly, the mechanism clicking faintly. The man stepped back, his movements silent but calculated. The door opened a crack, and the faint light from the hallway spilled into the room. "Mia, are you awake?" the woman asked, her tone laced with sleepy curiosity. Mia's muffled cries grew louder, her terror breaking through despite his grip. The woman pushed the door open fully, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. What she saw froze her in place, her daughter's wide, tear-streaked face, and the dark figure looming above her. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. Then she screamed, a piercing sound that shattered the stillness of the house. The man lunged toward her, knife in hand, the blade glinting in the moonlight. She reacted instinctively, slamming the door shut and throwing her weight against it. "Help!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. "Someone help!" The man cursed under his breath, his plan unraveling before his eyes. He yanked the door open, shoving her back into the hallway. Her hands flew up, pushing against his chest, her eyes wild with panic. "Mia, run!" she shouted, her voice cracking. The little girl scrambled off the bed, her small feet hitting the floor with a soft thud. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting between her mother and the man. "Go!" her mother screamed again, her voice breaking through the chaos. Mia bolted, her tiny figure disappearing down the hallway as the struggle intensified. The man snarled, his focus split between the fleeing child and the woman fighting him with every ounce of strength she had. The sound of doors opening, footsteps rushing, and voices shouting echoed through the house. The family wasn't alone. Voices filled the house, sharp and frantic, cutting through the chaos. "Call 911, someone yelled, their words distant but urgent. The man gritted his teeth, his plan disintegrating into shards of panic. He shoved the woman hard, sending her crashing into the wall. Her head struck the corner with a sickening thud, and she crumpled to the floor. For a moment, she didn't move, her body slumped, her breathing shallow. The man turned, his mind racing, and bolted toward the hallway. He needed to get out. Mia's small figure disappeared around the corner, her sobs echoing faintly. He chased after her, his heavy footsteps pounding against the wooden floor. But the house was alive now, its occupants stirring, barriers rising against him. A man emerged from a bedroom, tall and broad, his face etched with fury. "Hey!" the man bellowed, blocking the intruder's path. The knife gleamed in the dim light, and for a brief moment, hesitation flashed between them. But the larger man didn't flinch. He lunged forward, grabbing the intruder by the wrist. The two struggled violently, their grunts and shouts filling the narrow space. The knife clattered to the floor, skidding beneath a nearby cabinet. More footsteps thundered from behind, others rushing to the commotion. The intruder twisted and thrashed, but the larger man held firm. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, his grip tightening. From the corner of his eye, the intruder saw Mia at the end of the hall. She was huddled with another woman, clinging to her leg, her tear-streaked face buried in her shoulder. The intruder's expression flickered, something between frustration and desperation. He lashed out with his free hand, striking the man holding him. The grip loosened just enough for him to slip away, staggering toward the staircase. "Stop him," someone shouted, but he was already bounding down the stairs. The front door loomed ahead, his escape within reach. Behind him, chaos erupted as family members scrambled to contain him. But he was fast, driven by adrenaline and the primal instinct to survive. He reached the door, wrenching it open, cold night air hitting his face like a slap. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights danced against the horizon, closing in. For the first time, fear gripped him. Real, undeniable fear. He ran into the night, the sound of shouting and sirens chasing after him. But the town wouldn't let him disappear into the darkness. Not this time. The man sprinted down the street, his breath coming in ragged gasps, heart pounding in his chest. The sound of sirens grew louder, the flashing lights casting a frantic glow over the empty road. His footsteps were fast, desperate, each one a reminder that time was running out. Behind him, the sound of doors slamming open and distant shouting echoed through the night. He had to get away, but the weight of the situation was beginning to bear down on him. The familiar streets felt foreign now, as though the whole town was awake, alert, hunting. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, a police officer, walking briskly toward him. The man's pulse quickened, his mind racing. Should he keep running? Should he fight? There was no time to decide. He turned sharply down an alley, hoping to lose his pursuer in the maze of narrow paths. But just as he rounded a corner, a flashlight beam swept through the darkness, blinding him. "Stop!" the officer shouted, his voice cutting through the night air. The man hesitated for a split second, his mind scrambling for an escape. Then he ran again, faster, his legs burning with effort. The officer was right behind him now, calling for backup, but the man couldn't hear anything beyond the pounding of his feet. He ducked down another alley, a dead end that he hadn't noticed in his frantic escape. He stopped in his tracks, breath catching in his throat. The alley was narrow and high-walled, the only way out blocked by a row of dumpsters. He turned to face the officer, who was closing in on him. The man's chest heaved as he reached into his jacket pocket, fingers curling around something cold. A sudden shot rang out. The officer dropped to the ground, his body jerking with the impact. The man's heart stopped, the world around him warping into a blur of panic and disbelief. He had fired, instinctively, with no hesitation. He had hurt someone. He had crossed a line. He stood there, his eyes wide with shock, the weapon trembling in his hands. Behind him, the sound of approaching sirens had grown deafening. The game was over. The man stood frozen, the weight of the gun in his hand heavier than it had ever felt. The officer was down, but not out. The shot had grazed him, but the blood soaking his uniform wasn't life-threatening. Yet in the man's eyes, it felt like everything had changed. The officer groaned, shifting on the ground, his hand reaching for his radio. Desperation flooded through the man's veins. There was no time. He turned and ran again, but this time, the streets were not his allies. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the air like a swarm of angry bees. He was trapped. There was no escaping this. The shadows that once seemed like protection now felt like a cage closing in on him. Every alley seemed to end in a deadlock. Every turn brought him face to face with more patrol cars. A voice came over a loudspeaker from the squad car parked at the entrance of the alley. "Give yourself up. You're surrounded. There's nowhere to go." The man's breath came in ragged, desperate gasps. His thoughts scrambled, spinning in all directions. He could hear his heart beating in his ears, drowning out the rest of the world. The sirens, the voices, the chaos, everything became a blur. He stumbled forward, looking for any escape, but it was clear. There was none. A flash of movement in the shadows caught his eye. A figure, familiar, yet somehow foreign, stepped from behind a dumpster. It was him. The man standing there wore the same expression of panic, the same desperation. It was himself. For a moment, time seemed to still. His doppelganger stared back, eyes wild with fear, and then the world snapped back into motion. His other self ran at him, reaching out to grab him, but he didn't have the strength to fight anymore. The world was too loud, too overwhelming, and everything in it seemed like a blur. He raised the gun again, but this time it felt wrong. He wasn't trying to escape anymore. He was trying to end it. The sirens were deafening now. The world was closing in. And then everything went black. The world went still. For a moment, there was only silence, utter and complete. His body lay in the cold, gritty alley, the gun slipping from his hand. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, but they were slowing, weakening. The sound of distant sirens reached him like a far-off echo. His vision blurred, the once clear world swirling into an indistinct fog. His mind, consumed by chaos just moments before, was now empty. It was as though he was floating, detached from everything around him. Faint voices began to filter through the haze. People, officers, maybe even someone from the crowd that had gathered. "Stay with us, sir. Stay with us," someone shouted, but the words were muffled, distant. A hand pressed against his chest, attempting to apply pressure to a wound, but his body felt too heavy to respond. The light around him dimmed. His fingers twitched once, but there was no strength behind the movement. For a fleeting moment, he thought he heard a faint cry in the distance. Mia's voice, maybe. Or perhaps the echo of his own haunted thoughts. Then, darkness. Underscore 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 underscore. The next thing he knew, he was no longer in the alley. The world had gone quiet again, an eerie kind of stillness, like the calm after a storm. But this time, there was no fog, no blurring of lines. Just complete blackness, the kind that swallowed everything. His breathing had slowed. It was shallow now, weaker than before. His body felt disconnected from his mind, as though the two were no longer tethered. He could hear murmurs, but they seemed like they were coming from far away. Suddenly, the pressure in his chest increased. It wasn't the hand of an officer anymore, but something cold, something unfamiliar. His mind was fading, slipping further away from reality. He couldn't understand where he was, couldn't even remember how he'd gotten here. But in the deep pit of his chest, something lingered. A strange, gnawing sense of regret. A whisper in the dark. Had it all been worth it? Had it all been worth her screams? Had it been worth Mia's tears? The last thought was fleeting, and then nothing. Just silence. The sirens had faded, but the lights remained, spinning red and blue, casting a stark glow across the alley where everything had come to an end. The man's body lay still, the weight of his actions too much to bear, his chest barely rising and falling. But he was still alive. Barely. The officer who had been struck earlier was alive too, though unconscious and injured. But the situation had already shifted, the darkness that hung over the town lifting, just a little. The chaos in the streets had calmed, replaced by the quiet murmurs of onlookers, the hum of the radio, and the distant, almost serene calls of police commands. For a brief moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Inside the house, Mia's mother knelt beside her daughter, who was wrapped in a blanket, shaking but alive. The terror had passed for now. She pulled her daughter into her arms, her heart still racing, but a sliver of relief cutting through the fear. It had been close, too close. But they were safe. The man, the intruder, was lying unconscious in the alley, and soon he would face justice for everything. But what did justice really mean in this moment? Could it undo the pain he'd caused? Could it ever take away the terror that had gripped this small family's life? Mia's eyes, still wide with the echoes of fear, met her mother's gaze. "I'm okay, Mommy," she whispered, the words barely escaping her trembling lips. Her mother kissed her forehead, fighting back tears of relief. The officers arrived, quickly taking control of the situation, securing the area, and ensuring everyone's safety. But even as they moved in, something else lingered in the air. The shadow of what had almost happened, what had almost been lost. The town had been rattled, shaken to its core, and it would never forget what happened tonight. And though the man had been caught, though he would be tried and punished, the question remained: who had he been before all this? What had driven him to this point of darkness? Was there ever a way back from that? The days following the harrowing event felt like a blur for everyone involved. Mia's family, though shaken to their core, began the long process of healing. The shadows of that night still lingered, clinging to the edges of their days, but slowly, they learned how to move forward. The police investigation continued, unraveling the tangled threads of the man's past, his motivations, and the twisted path that had led him to this horrific moment. But the more they uncovered, the less it seemed to matter. There were no clear answers, no simple explanation for the darkness he had harbored. He had been broken long before he entered their home, a puzzle piece that never quite fit anywhere. Mia, The little girl who had been at the heart of it all was a survivor. But the terror would stay with her forever. Her mother held her close each night, whispering words of comfort, trying to erase the images that would haunt her for years to come. They sought therapy, surrounded themselves with love, and tried to rebuild what had been shattered. And slowly, the tight grip of fear loosened, though the memories would never be erased. The town, too, moved forward. The community that had once felt safe now carried an invisible scar. But as time passed, they began to rebuild their sense of security, bit by bit. The place that had been so familiar, so peaceful, was now marked by the violence that had touched it. And the man, the one who had terrorized them all, was sentenced to life in prison. But the justice he received was not enough to erase the trauma he had inflicted on Mia and her family. As the years went on, they would find a new normal, one forged in the fires of that unimaginable night. The shadows would always be there, but so would the light. In the end, Mia grew stronger. Her laughter returned, though it was softer now, touched with a quiet wisdom that came only with the weight of experience. And as she stepped into the future, the story of what had happened that night remained, not as something that defined her, but as something that shaped her into the person she would become. And that, in itself, was a victory.